Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. Today is, of course, the 1 year anniversary of the October 7th uprising led by Hamas that broke out of the Gaza prison, and also, of course, of the beginning of Israel's genocide against Gaza. And anyway, I'm going to go to a protest later today um, commemorating this. So I won't be around this evening to do a video. So I wanted to go ahead and do this now. What I want to do is just read the statement that I just published on my Substack blog and comment on it regarding Jill Stein and Butch Ware's uh, statement regarding their interview with Mehdi Hassan, where they responded at greater length than they had in their interview with him to his query about whether Vladimir Putin and Bashar al Assad, the president of Syria, were war criminals. And as you may have seen if you watch this channel regularly, I already did a video critiquing Stein and Ware's statement. But what I decided to do actually was write an alternative statement that I felt gave some of the detail and nuance that their statement was lacking. Oh, by the way, the virtual background I've got today is a picture of Damascus, Syria at night, which I thought was appropriate given the subject matter. So, anyway, without further ado, um, let me get the video of, or excuse me, the page that my uh, Substack commentary is on. Okay, so my blog post is titled An Alternate Version of the Steinwehr Campaign's Response to Mehdi Hassan. And I introduced it by saying complex issues require nuanced and serious discussion, not sound bites. In addition to discussing who is a war criminal, we need to discuss why there is a war in the first place. Because, of course, without a war, you couldn't have war criminals. If the war in Syria uh, did not exist, then had never happened, then there's not even a possibility that Bashar al-Assad could be a war criminal. And if that and the war in Ukraine didn't exist, there's no possibility that Vladimir Putin could be a war criminal. So again, what Mehdi Hassan asked Butch Ware and Jill Stein in his interview with him that you know, motivated them to issue a statement elaborating on their response to his question. Um, his question was basically, is Vladimir Putin a war criminal? Is Jill Stein a war criminal? Um, so Mehdi Hassan is a former MSNBC commentator who um, jumps through a lot of the usual hoops that you have to jump through in order to land such a position. But the one hoop that he wasn't willing to jump through was um, siding with Israel because he is of Arab descent himself, and I think he's still a Muslim. But anyway, um, nonetheless, he's still a shill for the Democratic Party. even though he's critical of the DNC stance on Israel. And in that uh, vein, his interview with uh, Dr. Jill Stein and Professor Butch Ware, the Green Party presidential ticket, was much more confrontational than he's tended to be with other politicians he's interviewed. For example, outgoing Democratic Congressman Jamal Bowman, who he interviewed after he lost his primary. Um, so he kind of channeled Piers Morgan in this interview because he was constantly interrupting and insisting that they answer questions that require extended responses, such as, is Vladimir Putin a war criminal, with yes or no. So uh, Jill and Butch agreed that yes, Putin and Assad were war criminals, but they weren't really satisfied with how the interview was conducted. They said that in their statement, which I'll just pull up here. Oh, huh. They might have deleted it. Okay. Well, good for them, I guess. Um, Let me look on Jill's Twitter page. Let's see. I think I have a link to it in my. Okay, so here's Jill Stein's Twitter post uh, where she appended a copy of their statement. So they start out saying, after a recent interview which did not provide the opportunity for nuanced and serious discussion of important and controversial topics, we want to take this opportunity to clarify our stance on key issues, particularly any misunderstandings regarding our comments about Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad. Our campaign condemns both Putin and Assad as war criminals responsible for immense suffering and devastation. Putin's military intervention in Syria, supporting Assad's brutal suppression of the Syrian people's uprising, is a stark example of his disregard for human rights. And then they go on to list Western war criminals like Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Barack Obama, and of course Benjamin Netanyahu. But with regard to um, Syria, they never anywhere in this statement mention the fact that the war in Syria happened because the U.S. Led an effort to try and overthrow the Syrian government. So anyway, let me get back to reading my statement. So I say, in my opinion, the Stein-Ware campaign brief statement did not provide the appropriate degree of nuance and detail regarding the issue of possible war crimes on the part of uh, the Syrian and Russian militaries and leaders. Because both the Ukraine war, in which Russia has been involved since 2022, and the Syrian war, which started in 2011, and in which Russia interceded in defense of the Assad government of Syria in 2015, they're complex topics that a brief statement, 635 words is the length of their statement, can't possibly do sufficient justice to. As I put it in a response to Dr. Stein's post that I just showed you regarding the statement, although it's true that there was a lack of opportunity for nuanced, serious discussion during the interview with Mehdi Hassan due to his constant interruptions and deceptive framing of issues, you've had all the time in the world to issue a nuanced statement. This ain't it. Having closely followed and written extensively about the Ukraine war and being relatively familiar with the Syria war, I decided to write my own statement representing how I would have responded in writing to Hassan's query. So both of those pieces are on my Substack blog. There's one. And there's the other. So that statement is below, as you see, and it's quite lengthy. It's about 4 times the length of their statement because there's just so much to say about this. To provide the appropriate context for how this war uh, in Syria and the war in Ukraine began. And because it was so long already, I focused entirely on the issue of possible war crimes uh, by Assad and Putin, and the context within which these wars happened in the first place. So I titled it "Discussing Who is a War Criminal Without Discussing Why There's a War Just Won't Do." Okay, so I'm writing this as if I were Jill Stein and Butch Ware and their team uh, writing a response to Mehdi Hassan. In a recent interview with us, Mehdi Hassan asked, "Is Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal?" and asked the same question about Syrian President Bashar al Assad. We do not believe this question was asked in good faith, because the point of this particular question was to get us to acquiesce to a simplistic both sides are bad framing that ignores or downplays the geopolitical context within which war crimes by Syrian and Russian troops and political leaders, and troops and political leaders on the other side of the Syrian and Ukrainian conflicts, such as Zelensky and Obama and so forth, are alleged to have occurred. While we agree that all allegations of war crimes on both sides of any armed conflict should be investigated, we believe that it is vital to discuss that context, not because it excuses the commission of war crimes by any of the parties involved, but because it is vital to the pursuit of peace to understand how the wars in question occurred in the first place and what it would have taken to avoid them and any resulting war crimes. Accordingly, we discuss this below. However, we'd first like to comment on Mehdi's general approach to the interview. He didn't only ask one question that seemed to us like it wasn't asked in good faith. His whole approach was confrontational. Rather than simply letting us answer the questions he asked, he interrupted us so often that. Wait, hold on, let me see if I'm in the right place here on the right page. He interrupted us so often that we had to repeatedly ask him to let us finish. And as if to confirm our impression that he wasn't interviewing us with the objective of helping us reach more voters via his large audience, he paywalled the interview and only released 2 short clips to the general public. So I must confess, I paid Mehdi Hassan $8 to be able to watch the entire interview. And I made sure I cut off the renewal of a subscription, but I wanted to see the whole video so I could judge whether or not the rest of the interview was similar in its confrontational tone to the particular clips that he released, which very much were. And sadly, yes, the whole interview was largely that way. Moreover, though he strongly disagrees with most Democrats on some issues, such as the Palestine conflict, nonetheless, he brought up most of the standard DNC talking points that we've been hearing for years. The claim that Jill supposedly spoiled, quote unquote, Hillary Clinton's election in 2016 by getting more votes than Donald Trump's margin of victory in key swing states, which, of course, is nonsensical because most Jill Stein voters never considered voting for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, and wouldn't have voted for either of them if they had been the only candidates on the ballot. Uh, the other claims, the claim that the Green Party was focused on the presidential race and doing little to build on a local level, the claim that Jill Stein might be a Russian asset because Vladimir Putin once briefly sat on the other side of her dinner table at a banquet she attended in Moscow 9 years ago, and the issue that is our focus here, the insistence that candidates for political office must jump through the major parties' hoops and condemn heads of state the U.S. government dislikes for war crimes they are alleged to have committed. So, if you recall, that was kind of when Tulsi Gabbard was running for president in 2019, 2020. That was kind of the price of admission that she had to pay to get interviews on mainstream media. Was she was required to condemn Bashar al-Assad as a brutal dictator, as she referred to him. Um, so, and the insistence that candidates for political office must jump through the major parties' hoops and condemn heads of state the U.S. government dislikes for war crimes they are alleged to have committed. We've responded to the other talking points at length in various interviews and statements, so we won't address them here. The central fact that needs to be understood about geopolitics is that the U.S. has been the most powerful imperial nation in the world for many decades, with its economic and military hegemony only recently being seriously challenged by the rise of China and Russia. It has resorted to military force and other undemocratic means to interfere in the affairs of other countries more than any other country, engaging in 251 military interventions just since 1991, over 500 in its history, backing dozens of coup attempts or military coups, interfering in dozens of elections, and imposing economic sanctions on dozens of countries. And the aim of these interventions has been to make other countries politically and economically subservient to the U.S., resulting in greater profits for U.S.-based multinational corporations, rather than allowing them to be sovereign, independent states pursuing their own developmental path. Similarly, the U.S. has sought to undermine all national liberation movements and their supporters, for instance, undermining efforts by the Palestinians to liberate themselves and undermining the axis of resistance supporting the Palestinian resistance movement, which of course includes Syria, and that's important here. Syria and Russia, and previously the Soviet Union, have very much been among the victims of U.S. imperialism's efforts to sabotage countries' sovereignty. Syria has been the crosshairs of the U.S. empire ever since it gained its independence from France in 1946, with several CIA-backed coups and coup attempts taking place over the ensuing decades. A 1986 CIA document stated that, in our view, U.S. interests would be best served by a Sunni regime controlled by business-oriented moderates. So, in other words, the CIA there is arguing for the overthrow of a secular Syrian government led by Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, which was allied with the Soviet Union by pro-Western Muslims. And in 2001, the Bush administration's Department of Defense wrote a memo calling for the overthrow of 7 governments of Muslim-majority countries, which are Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. And we know that they succeeded in overthrowing the governments of Iraq and Libya, and they've certainly tried with Syria. I guess they're working on Lebanon now too, through their Israeli proxies. So shortly after that, in 2005, the Bush administration began funding the Muslim Brotherhood and other Syrian opposition forces. And just to interject here, as you can see, I've put a whole bunch of links in here in case you want further details or, sources for the stuff I say in my statement. Okay, continuing. Only a decade later, the so-called Arab Spring, political uprisings in several Arab countries that included Syria and Libya, broke out, providing opportunities for U.S. regime change efforts. And as I add, they broke out with considerable help from the U.S. government, meaning um, uh, a lot of the Arab Spring was you know, initiated by Western covert operations, and in both Syria and Libya, uh, the so-called Arab Spring evolved into uh, an effort to overthrow those two governments. They succeeded with Libya. Um, in Libya, the popular government of Muammar Gaddafi, under whose leadership Libyans had the highest standard of living in Africa, was overthrown by the combined efforts of quote unquote rebels who were largely CIA backed Islamic fundamentalists. You know, in case you don't know, the acronym ISIS stands for um, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Um, but they were also in Libya. Despite Libya being nowhere near the North Atlantic, NATO also intervened with a bombing campaign. Um, so they succeeded in overthrowing Gaddafi's government, and Libya has been a mess ever since, with there even being cases of people literally being enslaved in the 21st century. In Syria, a multitude of countries or forces participated in an attempt to overthrow the government of Bashar al Assad, including the US, Israel, Turkey, the UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Netherlands, Kurdish nationalists, and various largely Islamic fundamentalist armed factions, including ISIS and al Nusra, which is basically rebranded Al Qaeda. Under President Obama's Operation Timber Sycamore, the CIA armed and trained what were misleadingly described at the time as moderate rebels, largely religious extremists, not at all moderate, who had as their goal the establishment of a Muslim fundamentalist caliphate in Syria. With such a wide array of forces attempting to overthrow it, Assad's government wouldn't have survived without foreign help, which it got initially from Hezbollah, the armed uh, group created to defend Lebanon from Israel, with Iran also helping by supplying arms, uh, mainly to Hezbollah, I guess, and Russia, a longtime Syrian ally dating back to the days of the Soviet Union, helping diplomatically. However, the so called moderate rebels advanced to the suburbs of Damascus, Syria's capital, and accordingly, the Syrian government asked Russia to directly intervene militarily, which it agreed to do. Many Western leftists have objected to Russian or other intervention to defend the Syrian government, or even supported the efforts to overthrow Assad's government on the grounds that it is authoritarian. So here's an example of a Western leftist organization that basically supported the overthrow of Assad, despite it being led by the U.S. For the purposes of the U.S. ruling class. This Socialist Worker was a publication of the now defunct International Socialist Organization. Anyway, sorry, I just X'd out my screen sharing. Okay, so many Western leftists have objected to Russian or other intervention to defend the Syrian government, or even supported the efforts to overthrow Assad's government on the grounds that it is authoritarian. But Assad is the elected president of Syria. Um, he got a very high percentage of the vote in Syria's most recent election, and backing that up, opinion polls indicate that he's relatively popular among the Syrian people. Because I mean, even though there's authoritarianism, repression and censorship and so forth in Syria, as there is in most other countries, including the United States, um, given the choice between Bashar al-Assad, whose government is secular and has put in place a number of decent social programs such as universal health care, and nationalize Syrian resources such as their oil. So, he's popular because of things like that. And because the alternative is groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. So, even if Assad were unpopular, like, for instance, Biden or Donald Trump, how many Americans, even if they were among those who truly hate the sitting president, Joe Biden at the moment, would support a foreign backed military campaign to overthrow the U.S. government with Islamic fundamentalist terrorists playing a leading role? These are people who wanted to establish Islamic fundamentalist caliphate in Syria and every other country that they're operating in. Hardly anyone would, right? No Americans would want a terrorist-led attempt to overthrow the U.S. government. We wouldn't support that, and we'd also rightly be suspicious of the motives of the foreign powers who were backing this coup attempt. And Syrians feel similarly, even if they don't like Assad. Do they want a civil war, or not really a civil war, but a war instigated by outsiders? And all the destruction that goes with that. Do they want their secular government to be replaced by the equivalent of the Saudi Arabian government? No, of course they don't. As with Syria, there's a very long history of the U.S. and other Western nations attempting to subvert the Russian, and before that, the Soviet government. So, following the 1917 Russian Revolution, more than a dozen countries, including the U.S., invaded Russia in an attempt to overthrow the new Bolshevik government. Following World War II, as if to add insult to the injury of the Nazis having killed 27 million Soviet citizens, the CIA began backing Ukrainian Nazis. The very same Ukrainian Nazis who had collaborated with Nazi Germany and slaughtering over 1 million Ukrainian Jews during the Holocaust. And so their backing for these Ukrainian Nazis resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands during the ensuing decade as the Soviet Union fought to contain this attempt at destabilizing Russia, backed by the CIA, backing Nazis. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, efforts to weaken Russia and undermine its sovereignty continued. And of course, I'm leaving out a lot of history here of attempts to destabilize or politically interfere with the Soviet Union. U.S.-backed President Boris Yeltsin implemented neoliberal reforms such as mass privatization, removal of price controls, and an open door for foreign investment at the behest of Western economists. The result was utter economic collapse and considerable Western control over Russia's economy. Wishing to see Russia continue such policies, the U.S. massively interfered in the 1996 Russian presidential election to make sure Yeltsin was reelected, despite the unpopularity of his economic policies. It was hardly a covert operation. Time magazine boasted about the U.S. meddling in the election, making it their cover story in July 1996. So there you go. Yanks to the rescue: the secret story of how American advisors helped Yeltsin win. Um, you know, by pouring a huge amount of money into his campaign, for one thing. Uh, I should just mention here. There's a nice article from Monthly Review that I linked here about this uh, Western inspired disastrous economic policy of Boris Yeltsin and the effects that it had. And um, they talk about uh, you economic advisors who got Yeltsin's government to do this. One of them was Professor Jeffrey Sachs, an economist who is currently an advisor to the Jill Stein campaign. Now, he's changed his politics in a lot of ways since then. Very critical of U.S. imperialism these days. But back then, he was on their side. He, was one of the people who advised, you know, uh, Yegor Gaidar, Yeltsin's first economic czar, to dismantle the protections that Soviet citizens had from economic calamities and invasion of foreign capital and so forth. So, you know, uh, like it or not, if you're a Jeffrey Sachs fan, he was involved in this utter catastrophe in the early 1990s. Steady expansion of NATO continued throughout the 1990s and 21st century, with military bases and exercises and advanced weaponry moving eastward as well. Despite U.S. assurances that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward from Germany. Well, Poland is quite a ways eastward from Germany, and so are the Baltic states that are now also a part of NATO. And of course, so is Ukraine, which you know, uh, NATO has been threatening to make a member for a long time. The U.S. also backed "quote unquote" color revolutions in neighboring Georgia in 2003 and Ukraine in 2004. So they literally overthrew the Ukrainian government uh, once in 2004 and then again in 2014. So the better known coup is the 2013 to 14 Maidan Square coup, when the descendants of the very same Ukrainian Nazis that I was just talking about, that the U.S. had backed in the 40s and 50s, came to power more or less in Ukraine. Now, they didn't directly hold a lot of uh, federal offices in the Ukrainian parliament and so forth, but they had a lot of power in the military. So, Ukraine's new right-wing coup government banned the Communist Party and other left-wing parties, and imprisoned and tortured and executed political dissidents. Largely it was the Nazis that were doing the torturing and executing, but the government as a whole, which was led by right wing, but not really Nazi politician Petro Poroshenko. Um, he banned the Communist Party, imprisoned people, etc. The coup government also attacked the language rights of the ethnic Russian minority. So, as a result, anti-government protests broke out in cities around the country, particularly in the predominantly ethnic Russian eastern and southeastern regions. So the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, and Crimea in the southeast. Polls there indicated that the overwhelming majority of the population opposed the Maidan revolution. And in fact, in the 2019 election, when Zelensky became president, by far the most support he received was in those ethnic Russian eastern regions, because not only is he ethnic Russian himself, but he promised in his campaign that he would bring peace to eastern Ukraine and undo the attacks on language rights, where, for example, kids couldn't be taught in school in Russian anymore. And of course, he broke those promises and became very unpopular as a result. Okay. Anti-government protests broke out in response to this repression and these attacks, specifically directed at ethnic Russians, from the coup government back in 2014. So there were protests in cities all around the country, but especially in the Donbass and Crimea. Polls indicated there that the overwhelming majority of the population opposed this coup government. And these protests were violently attacked by the Nazis, resulting in strong separatist sentiment. Residents of both Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk voted overwhelmingly to secede from Ukraine, and the referendum that was on the ballot in Crimea additionally called for a vote to join Russia, which Crimea shortly did. And if you don't know anything about the history of Crimea, it was only in the Russian province of Ukraine because for some strange reason, Nikita Khrushchev put it there in 1954, even though residents of Crimea consider themselves Russian, and Crimea had been part of Russia, not Ukraine, for a very long time prior to prior to 1954. And prior to the early 90s, when Ukraine became an independent country. Of course, Crimea was part of the Soviet Union. So Crimea is protected because it's part of Russia. There's actually been a Russian military base there forever on the Russia's Black Sea port is in Sevastopol. So Crimea was pretty safe, although they did dam up a canal that supplied a lot of Crimea's water as punishment for them succeeding. They, meaning the Ukrainian government. So a civil war between the coup government and the Donbass provinces, which merely declared independence but didn't vote to ask to join Russia. So civil war broke out between those provinces and the Kiev coup government, resulting in 14,000 deaths between 2014 and 2021. Russia attempted several times to settle the conflict between the Kiev government and the Donbass region, starting with the Minsk Accords in 2014 and 2015. But Ukraine refused to abide by them. And then in December of 2021, Russia put forth proposals to both settle the Ukraine conflict and create a framework for peace in Europe. Part of the framework called for Ukraine changing its constitution to agree to not ever join NATO, which Russia considered an unacceptable threat to have this huge NATO country right on their border. But the U.S. and NATO just ignored their proposal. And of course, you probably know that there were also peace talks between Russia and Ukraine after the Russian special military operation or invasion or whatever you want to call it began, which was sabotaged by the UK and the US. Okay, so in mid-February of 2022, the Kiev regime, now the Zelensky regime, he was elected in 2019, dramatically escalated its shelling of the Donbass, and intelligence indicated that it was about to launch a ground invasion. Additionally, Zelensky, during February, reiterated his desire for Ukraine to join NATO, expressed a desire for Ukraine to acquire nuclear weapons and threatened to invade Crimea, um, which he had done before. Upon learning of that information, that Ukraine was about to launch a ground invasion of Donetsk and Luhansk, the provincial governments of Donetsk and Luhansk requested Russia's help in fending off Ukrainian troops, and the Russia-Ukraine war, or Russia-NATO war, began. And, of course, Donetsk and Luhansk had declared independence by a vote of their electorate in 2014. But I don't recall if there were any countries that recognized their independence, but Russia finally did in February 2022. And as Scott Ritter has pointed out, given that Donetsk and Luhansk had declared independence and Russia had recognized them as independent, Russia has a case that its invasion was legal under the circumstances. Whether it was the right thing to do to address the government's violence and threats is another matter. And we, I'm speaking, of course, for Jill Stein and Butch Ware here, think there were better other options. As I said, interjected there, I know Jill and Bruce disagree with Russia's invasion, so this is their opinion that I'm presenting here. I personally think it may have been the least bad among the options, because Ukraine certainly would have invaded. They had long expressed a desire to, smash the separatist resistance in Donetsk and Luhansk, and not given the autonomy that they desired. It's possible that Russia could have just sat and waited to see what would happen, and then if Ukraine did invade, then they could go in, or they could have sent troops just into Donetsk and Luhansk and dared the Ukrainian troops to attack them, rather than launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But they chose to do the latter. And I guess they felt like at least had the potential of preventing a lot of loss of life in Donetsk and Luhansk. However, of course, because the West pressured Ukraine to not settle the conflict, it's gone on now for 2.5 years, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops have been killed, and tens of thousands of Russian troops have been killed. So, and lots of Ukrainian infrastructure has been destroyed. So, obviously it hasn't been a good situation for Ukraine at all. But what would have happened if they had just let Ukraine invade Donetsk and Luhansk? We don't know. Okay, so anyway, back to the statement. Although we lack the requisite legal qualifications to say for sure, we acknowledge that there's a plausible case for the legality of Russia's intervention that Scott Ritter made in his article that I've linked there. The above discussion by no means is meant to excuse any war crimes that Syrian or Russian troops may have committed, or dismiss the possibility that they occurred. However, Russian and Syrian forces could not have committed war crimes had the wars in Syria and Ukraine not happened, and they would not have happened had the U.S. not attempted to make them happen in pursuit of its imperial objectives. So as Stephen Gowans puts it, from the birth of the U.S. empire's 13 English colonies in a stolen land to the present day, the foundation of the empire's foreign policy has been to crush any force of local independence and national assertiveness that stood in the way of enlarging the empire's dominant economic interests, whether it was those of land speculators, slaveholders lusting after land, manufacturers seeking foreign markets, or financiers pursuing profitable investment opportunities abroad. In the grips of an expansionary profit-making imperative, Washington is driven to replace all foreign governments which resist integration into the U.S. economy, including the Syrian, Cuban, North Korean, Venezuelan, and Iranian governments. And, you know, I mentioned the Russian government is also in the crosshairs of U.S. regime change opponents. Although the U.S. ruling class frowns on explicit public declarations of these imperial motives, such as Donald Trump's acknowledgement that U.S. troops are occupying the northeastern part of Syria in part in order to steal Syria's oil, it's not as though the U.S.'s motivations regarding Syria and Russia are deeply hidden. According to U.S. Special Representative to Syria James Jeffrey, the U.S. wishes to establish a degree of control over Syria similar to what it had in Japan at the end of the Second World War. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin publicly stated that the U.S.'s objective in its involvement in the Ukraine war, along with the draconian economic sanctions that Trump and Biden have imposed on Russia, was to weaken Russia. And a 2019 RAND Corporation document characterized the U.S.'s objective regarding Russia as being regime change in Russia, followed by the unrestrained pillage of Russia's vast natural resources by predatory foreign corporations. Moreover, it advocated using Ukraine as a tool for effecting destabilization of Russia. So it laid out a whole list of ways of trying to weaken Russia, and one of them was basically arming Ukraine to the teeth. In evaluating the possible commission of war crimes by the U.S. government's declared enemies, it is important to bear in mind that the U.S. ruling class has a strong incentive to distort or fabricate evidence in this regard, and there are many examples of this occurring. So, there have been all sorts of allegations of war crimes against Syria and Russia. A lot of them are fabricated, or they've kind of switched who the perpetrators are. So, for instance, the U.S. has repeatedly accused the Syrian government of using chemical weapons. But such allegations have repeatedly been debunked. And Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles were actually destroyed under OPCW, that's the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, under OPCW supervision in 2013 to 2015. Another example of fabrications about war crimes is the evidence-free claims of mass rape that have been made against Libyan, Russian, and Palestinian soldiers. So if you recall, they accused Gaddafi of giving his troops Viagra and telling them to go rape women. And the same accusation was made against Russia. And of course, the allegation that Palestinian armed groups raped Israeli women on October 7th is still going strong. The claim that Palestinians committed mass rape on October 7th is repeated to this day by Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris, while she and her fellow politicians ignore the openly acknowledged commission of mass rape of Palestinians by Israeli and military and security personnel, where literally you have people who have engaged in these crimes boasting about it on national television, and you have people rioting when the Israeli government was actually at one point going to hold one of these rapists accountable, and so that they just let him go free. But Harris and her fellow politicians ignore the mass rape of Palestinians by Israeli military and security personnel and falsely accuse Palestinians of it. And the same has happened with allegations against Russian troops. The U.S. and its NATO allies have also accused Russian troops of committing a massacre of civilians in Bucha and other war crimes that the evidence suggests were instead committed by Ukrainian military or security forces. So I've got a couple of links there regarding the evidence of these war crimes allegations. Um, and war crimes committed by the quote moderate rebels in Syria have similarly been misattributed to Syrian or Russian forces. Even Western human rights organizations and leftist media outlets like Democracy Now! Um, and organizations like the ISO are not immune to making false or misleading claims about the perpetration of war crimes by U.S. adversaries such as Syria and Russia. Perhaps because their funding sources often include the U.S. government, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, or U.S. foundations and billionaire philanthropists. So George Soros and his foundation, for example, are big donors to some of these organizations. Moreover, even the International Criminal Court appears to have a pro-U.S./Western bias. There's an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights Maria Yova-Belova for allegedly kidnapping Ukrainian children, despite a lack of evidence that this occurred. Instead, as you'll see if you look at the link there, what appears to have happened is that Russia evacuated civilians, including children, from war zones. As of this time, there's still no arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu for war crimes, even though video documentation of Israel's war crimes appears in social media on a daily basis. So there's an enormous double standard on the part of the International Criminal Court and its lead prosecutor, Karim Khan. Arrest warrant for Putin. So far, no arrest warrant for Netanyahu, although Khan has asked for one. To reiterate what we said earlier, credible allegations of war crimes should be investigated by international courts, regardless of which side of a conflict the alleged perpetrators are on. As for Mehdi's question regarding whether we consider Putin or Assad to be war criminals, that is, bear responsibility for war crimes, we acknowledge that it is plausible that they and or their troops are responsible for war crimes, not necessarily ones that I've referred to, which have been debunked, given how commonplace it is for war crimes to be committed in the course of wars. So, for instance, although it's almost universally believed that the Allies were on the right side of history when they were fighting against the fascist Axis powers, the Allies nonetheless committed war crimes, such as carpet bombing Dresden and nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki. War crimes have also been committed by national liberation movements, such as those in Algeria, South Africa, or India. And, we may find the same with the Palestinian liberation movement if there's ever an independent investigation allowed, which so far there hasn't been. So war crimes have been committed by national liberation movements such as those in Algeria, South Africa, or India. But that said, to focus exclusively on who is a war criminal while ignoring why wars occur in the first place, in most cases, the machinations of U.S. imperialism, and what the motives of those involved are, is to ignore the forest for the trees. So, the motive of U.S. intervention in Syria and that of its allies was to overthrow the Syrian government. The motivation of those defending the Syrian government, of course, was to prevent the elected government of Syria from being overthrown and replaced by a bunch of terrorist nut jobs. The objective of for instance, the Algerian liberation movement was to get the boot of France off of their neck. Whereas, of course, the objective of France was to continue having its colony in Algeria. So, war crimes were committed on both sides, but I don't know about you, but I definitely am on the side of the liberation movement, even if they committed war crimes. So anyway, uh, hopefully we'll have the kind of nuanced and thorough discussions of these sorts of issues that are needed rather than sound bites in the future. Uh, all right. Please like and share and subscribe. And go to my Substack and check out the article. Give it a thumbs up if you so choose and share it. And I will talk to you next time.